For 1100 years, it had never fallen. Not to the Persians. Not to the Arabs. Not to the Crusaders who'd tried and failed. But on a Tuesday morning in May 1453, the walls finally broke. And with them, an entire age of the world came to an end. The city the Romans had called the Second Rome, the city that had held the line between civilizations for more than a millennium, had roughly 50,000 people living inside it by the spring of 1453. Outside its walls, a young Ottoman sultan had assembled an army that outnumbered the city's entire population. And he had brought with him something the walls had never faced before. Something that changed the nature of war itself. But before we get to the canon, we need to understand what Constantinople actually was and why its fall sent shockwaves that historians still argue about today. Constantinople sat at the meeting point of two continents. Europe on one side, Asia on the other, the narrow strait of the Bosphorus threading between them like a needle. Whoever held the city held the hinge of the world. Trade routes, military corridors, cultural exchange, all of it passed through that single extraordinary point on the map. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, had built its entire civilization around this geographic fact. And for 1,000 years, that civilization had been a bulwark. A keeper of ancient knowledge, of Greek philosophy, of Roman law, of Christian theology. It was, in very practical terms, the last continuous link to the classical world. By 1453, however, that empire had been dying for a very long time. The catastrophe at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 had stripped away most of Anatolia. The Fourth Crusade in 1204, launched by Western Christians, against a Christian city, had sacked Constantinople itself, fracturing it in ways from which it never truly recovered. By the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire was not really an empire at all. It was a city-state. A ghost wearing imperial robes. The territory it controlled had shrunk to Constantinople itself and a scattering of holdings in Greece. The emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, commanded perhaps 7,000 defenders. The man preparing to attack him commanded somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 soldiers. That man was 21 years old. Mehmed II had ascended the Ottoman throne for the second time in 1451, at an age when most people are still deciding what to do with their lives. He was obsessive, brilliant, and consumed by a single ambition. He had studied the city's defenses since childhood. He spoke multiple languages. He read Greek and Latin. He knew the history of every siege that had ever been mounted against Constantinople's walls, and he knew why they had all failed. The Theodosian Walls, built in the 5th century, were not merely thick. They were a system. An outer wall, a terrace, an inner wall. Towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. A moat. Layer upon layer of engineered resistance. No contemporary army had the technology to breach them. So Mehmed commissioned new technology. Here is where the story takes a turn that feels almost modern. A Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantine emperor, and been turned away, reportedly because Constantine couldn't afford him, brought Mehmed a design for a cannon of extraordinary size. The gun they built together was, by accounts of the time, capable of hurling a stone ball weighing several hundred pounds. It took 60 oxen and 200 men to move it. When it fired, the sound was said to be audible from miles away, and the recoil shook the earth so violently that women miscarried in the city. That last detail may be legend. The cannon itself was not. The siege began in early April 1453. The Ottomans surrounded the city by land and by sea, and Urban's great cannon began its work against the Theodosian Walls. The Byzantines repaired the damage at night. The Ottomans destroyed the repairs by day. It was a brutal arithmetic, and it slowly favored the attackers. But the walls held longer than anyone expected. 7,000 men, behind stone that had stood for 1,000 years, against an army that dwarfed them, and still the city did not fall. Which raises the question that the defenders themselves must have been asking in those terrible weeks: was anyone coming to help? The short answer is no. And the reasons why tell us everything about the state of the medieval world in its final years. Western Europe had, in theory, a deep stake in Constantinople's survival. The city was Christian. Its fall would hand the Ottoman Empire a base of operations from which to press further into Europe as, indeed, it would. Appeals had gone out from the Byzantine court for years. The Pope had promised a crusade. The Italian merchant republics of Venice and Genoa had trading interests in the region. But politics, as it always does, intervened. Venice was at that moment in a diplomatic negotiation with the Ottomans. Genoa's response was limited to a small contingent of volunteers under a commander named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who arrived with a few hundred men and became the most important soldier in the defense. Hungary, which might have sent an army, was bound by a recent truce with the Ottomans. Constantine XI wrote letters, sent ambassadors, prayed. Nothing came. By mid-May, Mehmed was growing impatient. The cannon had done damage but had not yet broken the city's spirit. He tried a naval assault, which failed. He attempted a tunnel-digging operation beneath the walls, which the defenders discovered and neutralized. The siege had begun to feel like a grinding stalemate, and in a stalemate, the defenders had one advantage: time. If they could hold long enough, something might change. A plague might sweep through the Ottoman camp. A relief fleet might appear on the horizon. Then, in the darkness before dawn on the 29th of May, something else changed entirely. The final assault began around midnight. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops struck the walls. Irregular soldiers first, exhausting the defenders, then Anatolian troops, then the elite janissaries, the most formidable infantry in the world at that time. The fighting was savage. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander whose courage had held the defense together for weeks, was struck by a projectile and seriously wounded. He was carried from the walls. And this is the moment everything unraveled. When the defenders saw Giustiniani leave, when that central, visible figure of resistance was suddenly gone, something psychological broke. Historians debate whether it was panic, or simply the exhaustion of men who had been fighting without real sleep for weeks. But in the confusion, a small gate in the outer wall, the Kirka Porta, was found unlocked. Ottoman soldiers poured through it. And the last thing the thousand-year empire needed was a breach in the walls from behind. Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of Rome, tore off his imperial insignia and charged into the fighting on foot. He was never seen again. No body was ever conclusively identified. No grave ever found. He simply disappeared into the last hour of his empire, and the city fell around him. There is something almost mythological about that ending, a king who chose to vanish into battle rather than be taken, and indeed, for Greeks, the legend of the last emperor who turned to marble and waits beneath the walls became one of the most powerful folk myths of the modern era. Mehmed II entered the city later that day. He was 21 years old. He walked through the streets to the great cathedral of the Hagia Sophia, which had been the spiritual heart of Eastern Christendom for 900 years, and ordered that it be converted into a mosque. What fell on the 29th of May 1453 was not merely a city. The medieval world had been organized around certain permanent structures: the Christian Empire in the east, the papacy in the west, the idea of Christendom as a coherent political and spiritual force. Constantinople's fall shattered the eastern pillar of that structure permanently. Scholars and philosophers fleeing the city carried Greek manuscripts westward to texts of Plato, of Aristotle, of ancient medicine and mathematics, and deposited them in Italian libraries, where they fed into a cultural revolution already underway. What we now call the Renaissance was not caused by Constantinople's fall, but the fall accelerated it. The Ottoman control of eastern trade routes pushed European navigators to look for alternatives, which, within 40 years, would mean Columbus sailing west and da Gama rounding Africa. The age of exploration, the age of Protestantism, the age of the nation-state, historians trace threads back to this single point. Which is why some historians call May 29, 1453, the last day of the Middle Ages. It is an arbitrary line, as all such lines are. History does not change on a single morning. Empires don't die in a day, they die in centuries, and the paperwork just catches up eventually. But sometimes, there is a moment where the weight of accumulated change suddenly becomes visible. Where you can stand at a particular hour in a particular place and say, the world that existed before this moment and the world that existed after it were genuinely different worlds. Constantinople was one of those moments. The city itself survived, transformed. Mehmed called himself Caesar of Rome, Kaiser I Rum, and set about rebuilding the depopulated city as his capital. Istanbul, as it would come to be called, became one of the great cities of the world again. The Hagia Sophia stood. The walls stood. The geography stood. Only the civilization that had built them was gone. And somewhere in the rubble of the Theodosian Walls, or in the streets near the last breach, or perhaps just erased by history's indifference to the defeated, somewhere in all of that, a man who called himself Emperor of the Romans ceased to exist. The last emperor. The last unbroken thread back to Augustus, and Caesar, and the world those names had built. It had held for 1100 years. It ended on a Tuesday. If this kind of history is what you come here for, stay close, there's more to come.